Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. The Innocents, 1961 film. The Innocents is a 1961 British supernatural Gothic horror film directed and produced in CinemaScope by Jack Clayton and starring Deborah Kerr, Michael Redgrave, and Megs Jenkins. Based on the novella The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. The plot follows a governess who watches over two children and comes to fear that the house is haunted by ghosts and that the two children are being possessed. The title of the film was taken from William Archibald's stage adaptation of James' novella, falling within the subgenre of psychological horror. The film achieves its effects through lighting, music and direction rather than conventional shocks. Its atmosphere was created by cinematographer Freddie Francis, who employed deep focus in many scenes as well as bold minimal lighting. It was partly shot on location at the Gothic mansion of Sheffield Park in Sussex. The Innocents pioneered the use of synthesized electronic sound generated by Daphne Oram. Plot: Miss Giddens applies for a job as a governess. It is to be her first position, but the wealthy bachelor interviewing her is unconcerned with her lack of experience. He values his freedom to travel and socialize and unabashedly confesses that he has no room, mentally or emotionally, for his niece and nephew. They were orphaned and left in his care as infants, and he keeps them at Bly, his country estate. The previous governess, Miss Jessel, died suddenly less than a year ago. All he cares about is that Miss Giddens accept full responsibility for the children, never troubling him with whatever problems may arise. At Bly, Miss Giddens is instantly taken with Flora, the niece. She also forges a friendship with Mrs. Groves, the kindly housekeeper. The boy Miles is away at boarding school, though Flora delightedly insists that her brother is coming home. Miss Giddens then receives a letter saying that Miles has been expelled from school because of his bad influence on the other boys. Mrs. Groves says she cannot imagine Miles being a bad influence, and when Miss Giddens meets the boy herself, she too thinks his teachers must have exaggerated. He seems charming and mature, though perhaps too mature, with flirtatious flattery toward his governess. The children are friendly and polite, but Miss Giddens is disturbed by their occasional odd behaviors. They seem to be sharing secrets. She is upset by unexplained voices and by several visions of a woman and man whom Mrs. Groves identifies from their descriptions as Miss Jessel and Peter Quint, the uncle's valet, until his death. Eventually Mrs. Groves reveals that Quint was abusive to Miss Jessel and that they were indiscreet, performing sexual acts in plain sight of the other servants and even perhaps the children. After Quint's death, Miss Jessel went into a deep depression and drowned herself. When Miles recites a poem invoking a lost lord to rise from the grave, Miss Giddens concludes that the ghosts of Quint and Miss Jessel possess the bodies of the children so they can continue their relationship. She is determined to rescue them from this possession. One night Miss Giddens finds Flora at a window watching Miles, who is walking in the garden. When Miss Giddens escorts him to bed, he kisses her goodnight in a disturbingly adult manner. The next day Miss Giddens finds Flora dancing alone in a folly on the shore of the lake, and again sees the figure of Miss Jessel staring at them from across the water. Convinced that the children will be freed from the possession if they will confess what is happening, Miss Giddens begs Flora to admit that Miss Jessel is there. Flora begins to scream and cry, calling Miss Giddens wicked and insane. Hours later Flora is still hysterical, and when Mrs. Groves finally leaves her bedside, she says she cannot imagine where Flora learned such obscenities. Miss Giddens orders her to take Flora away from Bly. She is certain that Miles is on the brink of confessing his ordeal to her and that she must be left alone with him. That night, alone with Miles, Miss Giddens presses him to talk about the ghosts, and then about why he was expelled from school. Initially, and as usual, Miles is glib and evasive, but he eventually admits that he frightened the other boys with violence and vulgar language. Miss Giddens enjoins him to say who taught him this language and behavior. Miles suddenly begins yelling obscene insults and laughing maniacally, and Peter Quint's face appears in the window behind him, joining in the boys' laughter. Miles then runs outside. Miss Giddens follows, calling that all he has to do is say his name, and it will all be over. Quint appears on the hedge nearby, but Miles does not seem to see him, and screams that she is insane. He finally shouts Quint's name, then the hand of Quint appears. Miles grows still and falls to the ground. Miss Giddens cradles him, and assures him that he is free. She then realizes that Miles is dead. Sobbing in horror, she leans over him and kisses him on the lips. Production. According to Professor Christopher Frayling, much of the screenplay is derived from William Archibald's play of the same name, which premiered on Broadway in 1950, rather than coming directly from James' novella The Turn of the Screw. Frayling credits Truman Capote with about 90% of the film's script as it appears on the screen, although John Mortimer was brought in as an additional writer before filming to give a greater Victorian character to the film's dialogue. Frayling also attributes the Freudian subtext to screenwriter Capote, whose contribution gives the film a Southern Gothic feel, with the governess' repressed erotic sensibility counterpointed by shots of lush and decaying plants and rapacious insect life. Director Jack Clayton, though, chose to downplay this aspect in the finished film to preserve the ambiguity between the ghost story and Freudian element. Frayling brings to light the unreliable narrator intended by the Jack Clayton. Originally, the film was to open with a funeral scene. There are stills of the scene that circulated at the time, but Clayton during production elected to open with Darkness, a song sung by a little boy, and the image of Kerr's hands that are clasped in prayer with her rosary between her fingers. Gradually, Kerr's face is highlighted. The opening creates a sense of intimacy and, perhaps, trust that the governess should be trusted. But the use of darkness surrounding her suggests that it's possible that the story that follows could be nothing more but in her own mind, isolated and creating its own supernatural world. According to Frayling, Clayton wanted the film to be quite different to the Hammer horror films of the period, and employed a number of cinematic devices to achieve this, including using genuinely eerie sound effects and moody stylized lighting. For the first 45 seconds of the film, the screen is black and singing is heard, and only after this do the credits appear. Clayton, who had made previously films associated with a new wave, took on the project specifically to avoid being typecast as a new wave director by trying a gothic horror film. Too unsure that his child actors' performances were not too knowing, Clayton also withheld the full details of the story from Martin Stevens and Pamela Franklin, who only received those parts of the script that lacked the surprising and mysterious adult elements of the film. By such means, Clayton was able to create a horror film that left the strange events depicted for the viewer to interpret. 20th Century Fox insisted that the film be shot in CinemaScope, while Clayton wanted to shoot it in standard Academy ratio, feeling that he wouldn't know what to do with all the additional space on both sides of the frame. Oscar-winning cinematographer Freddie Francis insisted that he could make it work by using various colored gels and lighting to create a sense of darkness consuming everything at the edge of the frame. As the shooting progressed, Clayton found use for the edges of the screen and began composing for the CinemaScope format. Francis used deep focus and narrowly aimed the lighting towards the center of the screen. It was so bright on set in that area that actress Kerr showed up with sunglasses one day. Francis and Clayton framed the film in an unusually bold style, with characters prominent at the edge of the frame with their face at the center in profile in some sequences, which again created both the sense of intimacy and unease based on the lack of balance in the image. Clayton expressed his unhappiness with the script written by William Archibald, and brought in Truman Capote to rework the script. Clayton wasn't a huge fan of the play, but saw potential in the themes and play, wanting to reshape it to his vision. In fact, the script used the play as its basis, not Henry James' novella. Capote brought the Freudian symbolism that is prominently highlighted in the relationships and the visual compositions. Clayton later brought in writer John Mortimer to give the dialogue a Victorian Polish. Clayton needed to maintain a sense of claustrophobia and, at the same time, open up the play, which took place entirely in the drawing room of the house. Clayton saw the house as one of the characters in the film and used it as such to highlight certain scenes. According to Frayling, the film feels much longer due to the use of long dissolves throughout the film. The Innocents was the big career break for renowned film editor Jim Clark, who was hired on the recommendation of his colleague Jimmy Ware, editor of Clayton's first feature, Room at the Top. In his 2010 memoir Dream Repairman, Clark recalled the experience as a true collaboration and that he and Clayton became close friends and regular drinking partners during production, since both were single at the time and lived near each other. He described The Innocents as a real pleasure to edit, since Jack had a very certain approach to his material, having worked out everything beforehand. He was a perfectionist who left nothing to chance, and was very precise in his approach to work. Inspired by George Stevens' A Place in the Sun, Clark created some rather cunning dissolves, which he also described as mini montages, in which he edited the crossfades between certain scenes to run 4 or 5 times longer than the standard mix, and often blended in a third near subliminal image. According to Clark, Clayton went through a lot of anguish over the final scene, in which Miles dies in Miss Giddens' arms, and that the director was quite prone to agonizing over scenes if he was uncertain of them, and we would run them over and over again, hardly changing a frame until he felt reconciled to the sequence. Clark also revealed that, despite their previous harmonious working relationship, he unexpectedly fell out with Clayton just before the film was released, and felt that he had allowed himself to become too close to his director. Clark recalled that, on the evening of the pre-release critics screening, Clayton went into a rage because his personal assistant Jeannie Sims was late in phoning him with a critic's reaction. When Sims called Clark to Clayton's office the next day, he discovered that Clayton had completely smashed a large plaster-scale model of Bly House, and was refusing to speak to either of them. In spite of this rift, Clark and Clayton gradually repaired their friendship, and Clayton subsequently invited Clark to edit his next film, The Pumpkin Eater. Reportedly, when first screened, 20th Century Fox executives were disturbed by the scene in which the governess kisses the boy Miles directly on the lips. The film has been given a 12 rating by the BBFC. Its original classification by the BBFC was X, which meant that no person under the age of 18 years was allowed into the cinema to see it. Reception. Although not a box office success at the time of release, The Innocents is now regarded as a classic of Gothic film. The film was nominated for 2 BAFTA awards, including Best British Film and Best Film. For his direction, Clayton was awarded the National Board of Review Award for Best Director. William Archibald and Truman Capote won a 1962 Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America for Best Motion Picture Screenplay. The film premiered in New York City on 25 December 1961, and was entered into the 1962 Cannes Film Festival. Bosley Crowther wrote an unfavorable review for the New York Times at the time of the film's release in December 1961, but we fear that old hands long familiar with the traffic and tricks of horror films will feel a bit bored by this screen version of Henry James' famous tale. The turn of the screw so mild and ingenuous it is alongside others of the genre, and especially do we fear they will be let down by the lucent performance of Deborah Kerr as the supposedly morbid young woman who is the focal figure in the tale, with a British cinematic re-release of The Innocents as part of the BFI's Gothic season in December 2013. The film has received overwhelmingly positive reviews from current critics. Peter Bradshaw, film critic for The Guardian, gave the film 5 out of 5 stars, praising it as an elegant, sinister, and scalp-prickling ghost story. Tim Roby, writing for The Telegraph, also gave the film 5 out of 5 stars, recognizing the immaculate directorial ability of Jack Clayton and commending the eerie, coldly beautiful adaptation of James' novel. Author and film critic Leonard Maltin awarded the film 3.5 out of a possible 4 stars, calling it a first-rate thriller. Director Martin Scorsese placed The Innocents on his list of the 11 scariest horror films of all time. Similarly, Andrew Pulver placed the film at number 11 in The Guardian's list of the best horror films of all time. Time Out named it as the 18th in a list of the 100 greatest British films. The Innocents currently holds a 96% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes from a sample of 46 reviews. Its consensus reads creepily atmospheric. The Innocents is a stylishly crafted, chilling British ghost tale with Deborah Kerr at her finest. Director Guillermo del Toro cites the film as an influence on his 2015 Gothic horror film Crimson Peak. In popular culture, Oh Willow Wally, the song from the film written by George Auric and Paul Den, and sung on the soundtrack by Isla Cameron, was released in the UK on a Decca single in March 1962. Oh Willow Wally was also covered by the Kingston Trio on their 1962 album Something Special. The song was also used during Derren Brown's Svengali stage show, played whilst Svengali possessed an audience member brought on stage to participate in the illusion. Oh Willow Wally can also be heard in a trailer for the 2014 horror film The Woman in Black, Angel of Death. The Infant Kiss, a song by Kate Bush from her 1980 album Never Forever, was inspired by the film. An audio track from this film was sampled into the cursed tape of the 2002 film The Ring. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?